The high hall of Winterfell still smelt of smoke and boiled leather, of stewed onion and charred venison, of wet wool and the sharp animal tang of men recently at death's door and now pulled back to sit among the living. Beneath banners patched with blood and wind, the long boards were crowded, torches guttered, shadows trembled on timbered walls. Survivors laughed too loudly or not at all. Some stared into their cups and saw faces they would never drink with again. Near the far end, beneath the carved direwolves, Jon sat between Sansa and Daenerys. He had not slept more than scattered hours since the dead came with their frost and their quiet. He felt a hollowness inside him that meals could not fill and wine could not soften. Yet his blood had its old heat tonight, the dogged kind that rose for duty. He looked along the tables until he found the smith who kept glancing at the door as if it might become a forge mouth and spit back a better world. Gendry was broader than when Jon first saw him in the stone belly of Dragonstone. The winter and the work had added a hard weight to his shoulders. He wore new leathers, tanned dark, the seams straight. Someone had dressed him carefully, yet he had sanded the edges himself so they would not cut when he moved. He smiled when Davos clapped him on the back. He stood when Arya slid onto the bench beside him and stole his cup. He did not know that a listening quiet had gathered around him, that men and women watched not just him but Jon, waiting for a sign. Jon let his fingers close around the carved cup that had been his father's. He did not drink. He stood into the hush. "My lords, my ladies," he said, and the old hall answered with the soft creak of men turning to face him. "We've buried the dead. We will bury more. But while we breathe, we owe the living more than lament. We owe them order." He felt Daenerys turn her head, felt Sansa's stillness, Tyrion's pale gaze like a knife side-on. Varys, an island of quiet in the eddying noise, half smiling as if nothing in the world surprised him. Jon lifted his voice. "We made a king once, in a hall not far from this, to keep the north. That vow bound us to care for the people beneath our walls and the land beyond our walls. But the war is not the North's alone. The realm is one body, and we've come too close to cutting it to pieces. Some ties must be mended. Some houses must be raised again." He let the words weigh the air. Robert Baratheon left a son. There was a stir, a rustle like a wind through dry pine. Gendry had risen without seeming to know he was rising. He looked as if someone had claimed his name from the air. Davos, who understood a dozen kinds of silence, kept his hand light near the lad's elbow and said nothing at all. Jon stepped down from the dais. He walked the length of the hall until he stood before Gendry. "You fought here," he said. "You fought for the living. When the dead came, you swung iron until your hands bled, and then you kept swinging. You did not need a name to do it." He looked past Gendry to the faces watching. He did not need a name to do it, but names are not only vanity. Names bind duty and call vows to heal. He drew breath. Many times as a boy, he had stood before the fire in the Lord's Solar and repeated the oath of the Night's Watch until the words were brick and blood in him. He spoke now as he had then, in the plain cadence of a man binding himself with his tongue. "By the honor of my house and the weight of my crown, in the sight of gods and men, I, Jon of House Stark, King in the North, Lord of Winterfell, do recognize the blood of Robert of House Baratheon in the veins of this man. I declare him trueborn. Let him bear his father's name and stand in his father's place. Let him be Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, Warden of the Stormlands, if the Stormlands will have him, and a bulwark to the realm." He did not look toward Daenerys. He kept his gaze on the smith, whose face had become the face of a child who had heard a story and only now realized he was inside it. A scar showed whitely on Gendry's jaw where a long-ago helmet had kissed him too hard. His mouth opened and closed, fish in a bucket, until Arya's fingers, quick and merciless as always, found his and squeezed. Then the boy, no, the Lord, went to his knees. "I swear," Gendry said, his voice rough as a rasp. "By the Seven and by the old gods if they'll have me, I swear to keep the people safe. I swear to keep faith with my friends. I swear I'll not forget where I came from." There were cheers, ragged, many from men who had never cheered a Baratheon in their lives. Davos swallowed something in his throat. Tormund barked a laugh. Brienne of Tarth, who had been standing behind Sansa like the idea of an oath made flesh, brought her gauntlet hand to her chest and bowed her head a fraction. The light found her eyes and set them wet. Tyrion watched the queen without appearing to watch her. Daenerys's mouth had become a painted thing, a pleasing shape a little too careful. She applauded last. Later, when the worst of the relief had surged and ebbed and the laughter turned muddy with wine, Jon found Daenerys in the little solar off the hall where Robb once sat with a map weighted by stones. The fire snapped and threw light like small knives at the books on the shelf. She stood with her back to him, her hair bound and braided, the gold rings catching the red from the coals. "You did a queen's work," she said without turning. "I did a king's." She turned then. Her eyes were bright and unreadable. "And when did you begin crowning lords from the Stormlands?" "When the war made me answerable for more than one line on a map." "You made yourself answerable." She took a step. "If a king's words can lift a bastard into a lord here, then a queen's words are nothing in this hall." "They're not nothing," he said softly. "You know that." "I know I had thought to offer the boy the very gift you wrapped for him." She smiled without kindness. "Good politics. Earn a heart. Buy a province. It's not only politics. It never is," she said, and for a moment weariness sharpened her voice and made it the truth of her. "I am not blind to kindness, but kindness that serves a plan is still a plan." She lifted one hand and let it fall. "I would have given it publicly and bound the Stormlands to me with gratitude. You have bound them to you." She moved past him then, brushing his sleeve with her own, and the heat of her was a promise and a threat both. "Will you unmake it?" he asked. "Unmake a Lord of Storm's End?" She laughed, low, almost startled at the thought. "I am not my father." She stopped at the door and half-turned. "Remember that you are not either." When she had gone, Tyrion slid from the shadow behind a shelf and poured himself wine as if he had always lived upon that spot. "That went almost well," he said. "What do you want from me now?" Jon asked. "Only to beg you, on behalf of wine everywhere, not to make any more surprises for the queen until morning." Tyrion lifted the cup. "A wager, Lord Snow." "Pardon me, your grace. You could have waited. You could have let her offer the gift and thus gained her something without losing anything yourself. You knew what she meant to do." "I didn't," Jon said. He had known she was thinking something. He had not thought of the boy with a title like a token to be laid on a table. Tyrion's mouth pulled sideways. "Ah, in that case your honesty will make you a very poor player. Take heart, though. It will make you a better man." "Is that what the realm needs?" Jon asked. "Needs?" Tyrion took a swallow. "The realm needs many things and receives very few of them. A Baratheon hammer in the Stormlands might at least keep the walls upright when the sea remembers its old tricks." "Then we agree on something." "We agree on a great many things," Tyrion said, and watched him as if he were a board with too few pieces left on it. Sansa came to him when the hall had half emptied and the servants were scraping bones into pails. "You did it," she said without greeting or smile. "Not as neatly as you might have, but you did it." "You disapprove?" "I approve so much I resent that you didn't consult me," she said flatly, and then, to his surprise, she reached and touched his arm. "It was right for the realm, and for the boy. He will need help." "Davos is a good man," Sansa said, "but he is not a steward. Send him as escort and counsel, but let the rest fall to paper. I will send a letter on the morrow to Master Wolkan to prepare the seals and contacts for the Stormlands. We will lend him a steward to keep the accounts, and a maester if Old Town will allow it. There is a good man in White Harbor who does sums like a septon, too. And I will send a letter to Evenfall Hall." "To Tarth," Jon said, glancing toward the tall shape near the door where Brienne was quietly watching everything. "Would she accept him?" "She will accept the Stormlands whole if there is a Baratheon to hold them. The old blood remembers." Sansa's gaze went to Gendry, now bowing his head much too often at too many toasts. "Poor boy. He looks as if you set the moon in his hands and told him to keep it from melting. He just needs time, Jon said. He needs to be reminded that lords do not swing hammers over their own heads. They make other people do it for them and hope to sleep at night. Sansa's voice softened. He'll learn the rest. Men who know hunger tend to use their kitchens well. Arya was harder. She came up like a draft, quick and chilly, and put her shoulder against a beam beside him as if they were children again, hiding from scoldings. "You've made him a lord," she said, and her mouth held a shape Jon knew well. Pride that tasted of trouble. "It was needed," he said. "He asked me to be his lady. I think it came into his head on the road between the dead and the drink. I told him no. I told him I'm not a lady." He looked down at her. She kept her eyes on the hall. "You did right to tell him the truth. I do that sometimes." She let out a breath that might have been a laugh. He looked hurt, and then he smiled like a dog with a broken ear and said he knew all along. "He doesn't," Jon said gently. "I know." Arya shifted. "He will be good at being a lord if you can be good at such a thing. He likes people. He likes to fix things. He doesn't like to send anyone away hungry. That's a start. You owe him a good steward and a captain with a brain." "Sansa has a steward in mind," Jon said. "Arya," he added when she would have left. "If you'd wanted." She cut him with a look and then softened it because he was Jon. "I don't want. Not that. I have other things. The hound. The road," she said, and went to return Gendry his cup. Davos found Jon near the end and stood with his hands folded in front of him, as if he were back in the Queen's men and begging the gods' pardon for his sins. "Your Grace," he said, and the title still sat crooked on Jon's shoulders. "I thank you for doing what the realm should have done long ago. I did not do it for thanks." "Good, because you won't get much," Davos said cheerfully. "But you will get a Baratheon on a wall that was built to make men better than they are. I mean to take him south soon. Storm's End doesn't wave itself back into your hand. It needs talking to and knocking at in equal helpings. Take good men," Jon said. "Take a banner. And take a letter to each of the houses that once bent knee to the stag. Swan and Fell, Grandison and Morrigan, Penrose and Dondarrion, Tarth and Estermont if you can reach them. Tell them the storms are not only weather. Tell them the realm needs their walls. You make a fair speech for a boy who learned to track in the snow," Davos said, then sobered. "You will make enemies with this." "I've made enough," Jon said. "One more will not crowd the room." On the third morning they left Winterfell. It was one of those pale mornings when the cold is no longer a knife but a memory. When smoke lifts slowly from the chimneys and the frost on the outer bailey looks like powdered stone. Gendry sat a brown gelding that did not care who sat him, and he wore a mail shirt that had been Jon's once, well mended and made to fit with leather at the sides. Davos had a grim northerner to lead a dozen men with spears. He had 3 Riverland horsemen who had seen 2 wars and lived, and he had a boy from the winter town who could add and write like a scribe, the steward Sansa sent despite herself. He had a roll of letters and a fold of hard cheese and a faith that tasted like salt. They took the King's Road because there was no better road and because a road you knew could still surprise you. But not all surprises were bad. In the barrows, in the shadow of stones raised by hands that had forgotten their own names, they met small folk dragging brush to rebuild the fence rows. Gendry was off his horse before Davos had finished blinking and had the boy's pole in his big hands, and he helped them push and bind and twist until the fence stood again. The men of the party did not know whether to laugh or scold, and so did neither. The old woman of the cottage, who had no teeth and one eye like river glass, put a hand to Gendry's cheek as if he were kin. "Lord," she said, and the word made him look over his shoulder as if there must be someone else. South of Moat Cailin the land opened. The fens turned to heather and then to green. The sky remembered how to be blue even as clouds shouldered one another like men waiting for a brawl. At a way castle Gendry found the smith had died in the cold, the forge dead since the snows. He mended a broken wheel with borrowed nails, then sat on a 3-legged stool and stirred the fire until the coals were awake and orange and temperamental again. It pleased him in a way that titles could not touch. He joked that a lord should know the weight of his own hammer, else he was only a feather with a name painted on it. Davos took care not to put that into a letter. At the Trident, they found a blackbird stuck in a fisherman's nets and teased it free with hands that smelled of rope. At the crossroads, and they slept with knives within reach because the wrong kind of men had begun to remember that the world had gone soft and unguarded in the terror's wake. Once, just south of the God's Eye, a band of 6 tried to fall on them at dawn, half-starved and ill-armed but desperate, and a glance from Davos had the Northerners form like a door and the Riverlanders pivot like hinges. It was over quickly. Gendry stood in the long wet grass afterward with his breath, a saw in his chest and blood on the rivets of his mail, and he looked down at the boy he had hit too hard with the back of his hammer. He knelt. He put 2 fingers on the boy's throat and found nothing but the memory of a beat. He closed the boy's eyes and said, in a voice like an oath, "We're all worth more than this. You did what you had to," Davos said. "I know," Gendry said. "I hate that I know." Evenfall Hall answered first. The Lady of Tarth's steward sent an escort of 4 knights with sapphires on their cloaks, men whose courtesy was as stiff as a brace. They rode with their heads high and, when they stopped for the night, their talk was less of the South than of the old days when the Baratheon court had been full of laughter and noise and appetites that kicked the table. "They were loud," said Ser Roland, who had kept his hair in a soldier's crop even in peace. "Loud men, loud women, loud songs, loud lies, but I'll take loud over whispers." At Evenfall itself, the sea sang around the island hall and the gulls talked like wives and the stones had the look of something that meant to outlast men in the way that trees did. Brienne was not there. She was far away, at Winterfell with her oaths. The Castellan bowed and put a square hand over his heart. "We kept a chair empty," he said, "in the second hall, a chair that faced the west." Gendry asked, clumsy with new habits, "Why the west?" "Because storms don't ask whether the door is on that wall," the Castellan said, "and we like to see what's coming." They took ship at Tarth and crossed to the Stormlands on a day of intermediates. The sky could not decide. The wind could not either. The sea would not tell them what it meant to do. Gendry watched the shape on the horizon resolve. A double line of black that took on weight and angle and then stood up against the sky. Storm's End was not beautiful. It was a story told by engineers. It had been set there as a dare to the weather, and it had become a dare to men. The Castellan Cersei had installed was a crown man named Ser Harbert Errol, short, square, a veteran of no war worth the telling. A steward's son who had been a steward's right hand his whole life and had been given a sword so that he could better guard the keys. On the outer causeway, he met Davos and Gendry with 24 men at arms. "Go home," he said without malice. "The Queen sits the Iron Throne. Storm's End is hers." "The throne used to sit a Baratheon," Davos said mildly, "and this seat before it did." "Used to," Ser Harbert said. "What is done is done." Gendry swallowed and stepped forward. He had no practice at speaking to brick walls or men who longed to be brick walls. "I'm Gendry," he said, "Baratheon. I've a letter from the king in the north naming me Trueborn, and a letter from the Lady of Winterfell lending me a steward. I have men from the houses of Tarth and Fell and Morrigan who will swear they'll swear if you open the gate. Open it and will not spill blood in the courtyard. The Stormlands need their lord." "Do they?" Ser Harbert asked, curious as a math problem. "They have had no such thing for some time, and yet the rain falls and the fishermen go out and come in and the stores fill and empty according to the year. A lord is not a weathercock. He is not necessary to wind or wheat. He is necessary when Euron Greyjoy fancies you soft," Davos said. "Ah," Ser Harbert said, "that is the only argument I have heard this month I did not already hear last month. Leave your letters. Wait at parchments. I will send a raven." "Wait," Gendry asked. "For permission," Ser Harbert said, and then almost smiled. "Unless you mean to batter down a wall that has eaten storms since long before your father was a spark in his father's eye." They waited. They rode to parchments, where the Penrose men were polite and hungry and said being polite made them hungrier. Gendry did not sleep well. His dreams were full of rivets popping under pressure, of faces behind arrow slits, of Arya leaning in a doorway and saying in that thin, steady voice, You want this because it is not a thing you can make with your hands. On the 5th day, the sea answered their impatience with a gale that went at the walls of Storm's End like a debtor with a new loan, and then, as quick as a mercenary, turned and struck at the fisherfolk in the shelter of the cove. Gendry saw it first from the head of the road where the granite gave way to scraped plate rock. Narrow boats were darting for the small beach behind the bend where an old pier leaned into the water like a drunk into a prayer. The wind took the 3rd boat and flipped her, tossing 2 men into the gray. The wave after that dragged one down like a cupboard door closing. Gendry did not think. He dropped the reins and ran. Davos swore and, a breath later, followed because water was in his bones and he could not help himself. The 4 Tarth knights shouted something about ropes that the wind ate whole. Gendry hit the water and it hit back and shoved itself up his nose and down his throat and hurled him against the pea. Ur with the impatient strength of a giant. He tasted iron and the salt that was older than any house's name. He did not see the man in the water so much as feel a hand glance off his shoulder like a trapped fish, and then he had the forearm in both his hands and was kicking and swallowing and cursing and loving the fight because it was simple. He woke under a tarred cloth with Davos's face the first thing he saw, and the ceiling of a boat shed the second. The 3rd was the castellan of Storm's End, wet from shoulders to knees, with his hair smacked to his skull and a certain look in his small eyes. "You're a fool," Ser Harbert said. "You don't even have heirs yet. Lords are supposed to live like cows and breed like them too." "Give me a gate," Gendry said, coughing. Ser Harbert's mouth wrinkled as if it wanted to be a frown and couldn't quite. "The ravens have not yet returned," he said slowly. "But it is a castellan's duty to preserve his lord's property in the absence of his lord. I take that duty seriously. It occurs to me that there may be an argument that letting a man prove he is the property constitutes preservation, at least in front of the men whose oaths will need somewhere to sit." He put his hands behind his back and rocked on his heels. "The outer gate is heavy. Mind your toes. They opened not 1 gate but 3, in ceremony as much as in architecture. The men of Parchments and Evenfall and Fellwood and Blackhaven came in by companies and small trickles, by strings of 3 horses and by foot with carts. They swore in the 2nd hall beneath a stag banner so old the black had turned to a deep green, and when Gendry stood to accept their oaths, he understood suddenly that the list of names he did not know was much longer than the list of those he did. He looked for Davos, who nodded once. He looked for Ser Harbert, who had drawn himself up with an air that said he had made a fine choice and now the world could do as it pleased. He looked last for the door, where a boy of 12 with sea salt hair pressed against the stone, eyes huge. "Come forward," Gendry said, trusting his impulse the way he trusted a fire when it was properly banked. The boy shuffled in, and Gendry said, "What's your name?" "Bran Penrose," the boy said, and added quickly, "Not that Bran. Different Bran," Gendry said solemnly. "It's a good name because it is a name with a different Bran in it. Can you read?" "A little." "Can you run messages?" "A lot." "Then you will bring messages to old men, and you will read them to men who pretend not to know how," Gendry said. "And when you have run enough you will sit and read, and someone else will run for you." He looked for the boy's father and found him at the edge of the crowd, smiling like a man who had found a coin in an old coat. "We need many hands for many things. A lord is only one pair." He went the next day to the county market in the shadow of the walls and bought. Not because he needed to, but because people needed to learn what it would look like. 3 carts of turnips and 2 of onions and a boatload of dried cod from a man with a beard like a ship's brush. He set prices and had them written in a neat hand by Sansa's steward and pinned them with iron tacks to the post. And when the first argument came he walked into it and listened with his head bent down like a taller man trying to hear a child, and he decided wrong and then corrected himself in front of everyone. "If I will be a fool," he said, "let me be the sort who tires of it." Cersei Lannister answered at last. Her letter arrived with a green seal the color of old copper, bearing the lion rather than stag. It called him bastard, without the courtesy of even his bastard's name. It told him the Iron Throne would be pleased to name an appropriate royal cousin to hold Storm's End until the matter of the pretended lord's impudence could be judged with due ceremony. It suggested that he present himself at the Red Keep immediately for a hearing that would, It implied, be held in the presence of the Queen's goodwill. It advised him to disband any forces he might have raised, that they might be spared discomfort. Goodwill? Davos read, and snorted so hard the candle wavered. She means to cut the head to spare the hair. Let her come, Ser Harbert said, and then looked faintly surprised at himself. She'll find the walls where they were last time she'd have liked them to go away. There was no time to teach the Stormlands in comfort. Euron Greyjoy's sails were shark's fins on the horizon within a week. He had not brought all his ships. Why would he? He liked to be everywhere at once. He sent long ships like knives, looking for a belly to slip into. He tested the cove behind the pier that had near-drowned Gendry and found it watched, and 2 of his boats came in and did not come out, and the men of Tarth and Fell dragged the wrecks onto the sand and set them on fire to make an answer that did not require words. The next day he tested the harbor proper, and his men tried a fast landing on the outer shore below the signal tower, and Gendry went down with the first wave. The hammer felt strange in his hand again, and then it felt like nothing at all because his hand forgot it existed when it met a shield rim and felt the give of ribs and hated the give and needed it and forgave it, all in one clatter of air and steel. After, Gendry sat on the spearmint that grew between the flagstones and breathed until his vision stopped narrowing and widening like a bad bellows. He wiped blood from the cheek of a boy who had cried without meaning to and said, too roughly, "Keep your shield up." The boy nodded and did so until he slept that night with his arm still raised. Gendry wrote to Winterfell. He wrote to Dragonstone, where the Queen had set her councils like chessmen on a dark, salt-smelling board. He wrote to the Riverlands, to Harrenhal, to men in the Vale who would not march but who might, with a nudge, send food. He had never written so much in his life. He had the steward read his letters back to him and fixed the places where he did not sound like a lord until he did, and then he crossed out the too fine words and put in plainer ones. He sent a letter to the blacksmiths of King's Landing, men who had once handed him nails across a bench and called him by names that had been none of them his. He told them where to hide their wives and children if the city burned, and how to get to the river if the streets ran. He told them to take apprentices home early on days when the wind came from the sea with a taste like coins. Jon came in person. He came with the Queen, and their ships bore the dire wolf and the 3-headed dragon and the silent promise that if they could not agree on everything they would agree on this. The Lannisters needed to be the past. The sea between Storm's End and Dragonstone ran green and white under a sky the color of hammered pewter. They stood together on the inner ward while a band of children played at knucklebones in the lee of the wall, sunlight finding every piece as if glass. "You've made a place," Jon said. "I've made a mess," Gendry said. "And I am cleaning it." Daenerys's eyes were as bright and pale as a winter sky that meant to be merciful. "Storm's End never did care for clutter," she said. "We tried to keep the bodies off the floor," Davos said. A lesser woman would have let the jest sting her pride. Daenerys smiled. "We will sail within 2 days," she said. "The fleet will skirt the gullet and come at Blackwater Bay from the east. The armies will march along the Rose Road and the King's Road. We will meet before the city. You'll keep men alive by the look of your cards," Davos said. "Avoid the scorpions on the walls. Keep the dragons high." Her mouth flickered. "I take counsel," she said, and Jon felt the edge there only because he had begun to know her. "We will not burn what we must rule. We will end the line of Lannister and offer the city mercy. Once. Tyrion has a plan for bells and surrender." "Bells," Gendry said softly. He had rung bells with his own hands in King's Landing, on days when a master had been too drunk to climb. He remembered the way the rope slithered in the hand and the way the iron voice of the bell rolled down the streets like a beast, turning all feet toward it. "Euron killed Rhaegal," Jon said. The words caught somewhere between his chest and his mouth. "Off Dragonstone with scorpions. We were not ready. We will be ready." Gendry swore for the first time that day. Davos looked down as if the boy had broken a cup. They marched. The north came like a dark river under banners gnawed at the edges. The Vale came in bright and neat, their mail glinting like fish scales. The Stormlands came in bits and begins. Men who had never sworn for 10 years and now swore to a boy whose eyes were open and whose hands were rough. Gendry rode at their head or among them, or sometimes off the road entirely with a woman whose husband had not come back and whose goat would not kid. Because sometimes a lord needed to be seen, and sometimes he just needed to be present when someone cried. Arya did not march with them. She and the hound slipped ahead like rumor. Gendry knew it because the world had become full of signs he had never been taught to see. Bread gone from a window ledge and a smear of ash on the sill. A wheel track where one ought to have been none. A waybread loaf left on a flat stone and tar pressed into it in the shape of a hound's head as a private rude jest. He smiled when he saw it. He stopped for a long time and then he went on. Before King's Landing the army spread like a tide seeking the right shape for the shore. Gendry looked at the city and saw all the things he had loved in it and all the things that had tried to kill him. He saw the mud gate, where old men had taught him to run when they shouted run. He saw the bell towers, hard and heavy and earnest against the sky. He saw the place where the great September had been, and where a raw, green emptiness was instead, shimmering in the heat with a smell like old candles and new rock. He thought of men trapped under it, and he thought of a queen in a high place watching the light turn that pale, false color and thinking, now. The Golden Company glittered on the field. A coin poured upon the grass. Euron's fleet glittered on the water. Knives turned flat to the sun. The dragons wheeled like ideas no one could quite hold. The city held its breath. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the camp a mule brayed. "Leave me some walls," Gendry said to no one in particular. "Only the old ones," Davos said. The plan was too careful not to be broken. Plans are for men and cities are for gods. The dragon came out of the sun. The first line of the Golden Company broke when their elephants screamed and turned because they were wiser than men. The scorpions on the walls shuddered and spat and then burned when the dragon taught them to. The fleet in the bay tried their best and died doing it. The water boiled and then it cooled and then it was a mirror again, but for ash. Somewhere behind all that noise a bell began to ring. Gendry was on foot by then. He had left his horse when it became kinder to be at eye level with men and not above them. He found the mud gate because his feet remembered it. He found the postern because his hands did. He found 2 city watchmen he had once drunk with 10 years ago, older, softer around the jaw, who recognized him and then tried not to because recognition could hurt. "I'm not here to hurt," he said. "I'm here to make you do what you want to do anyway." "What's that?" one asked, trying for a joke. "Open the gate." They did. They were cowards or brave, depending on whose mother you asked. The hinges complained. The chain came up as slow as guilt. Men who had once chased Gendry from a cart of stale oatmeal watched him walk into the city like a lord without a banner and did not stop him. He went to the bell tower at the September that was not there anymore and turned away, sick, and instead found the belfry of the mother's small septri off Ropemaker's Lane. He and Davos pulled the rope together. It burned. They rang it until their hands cried. The dragon circled. The bells rolled over the roofs and into the alleys and down into the cellars and under the stones and into the rat runs. The Golden Company was a handful of metal in grass. The Lannister men were dropping their swords. The city had chosen for once to live. On the hill the Red Keep was the color of old blood. Jon stood with Grey Worm and with the Queen. He could not see Gendry at the gate. He could not hear anything but the bells and the sound the dragon made with its wings. He looked at Daenerys and saw the past of her and the future of her and the way the present could be a trap. She closed her eyes. She opened them. The dragon went at the Red Keep. Some of it was mercy. That is what men told themselves after, because mercy was a word that let them sleep sometimes. The dragon burned the scorpions on the towers and the men behind them. The dragon burned the gatehouse and the soldiers clustered beneath it, pressing to get out and surrender. The dragon burned the outer walls of the Red Keep until the stone hissed and flaked. The dragon burned the ships that had not sunk. The dragon burned the armories because Tyrion begged her to and because he begged for a future with fewer scorpions in it. But the dragon did not turn upon the city proper. Not that day, not that hour. Daenerys was a woman holding a too-hot thing, and for a time she held it. Within the Red Keep, chaos was thin in places and thick in others. The mountain found the hound on a stair. The stair did not mind. They fell and rose and fell again, and a younger woman ran because sometimes that is the only thing that saves you. Arya reached the yard below the tower where she had once been a child who thought monsters were only men you had not yet seen under their skins. She pressed her back to a wall and breathed and thought of Gendry at a gate. He was there later when the first smoke had lifted and the first sobbing had stopped because mouths were too dry. He had soot in his hair and a burned stripe across one knuckle where a rope had taught him the cost of pulling too long. Arya came out of an alley as if the alley had grown her and set her down. They looked at each other and did not say anything for a long heartbeat. "You're a lord," she said at last. "You're not a lady," he said. She smiled in a way that could have cut leather. "I'm not. I didn't ask again." "Good," she said. "Ask me to eat." He laughed then, and the sound felt like rinsing a wound. Cersei Lannister did not go out in a torrent under the Red Keep. She did not stand with dignity and accept the end she had brewed for others. She tried to flee by way of the cellars and found them full of warmth that was not fire, a stench like old oil and secrets. Wildfire in jars, in nests, in whatever men call places where they set their sins for later. The first jar cracked on a breath of heat from the dragon's passage, and a burp of green lit the corner of a room that had not seen sunlight in 100 years. She tried to go back and could not. When they found her later, there was little left but the gold on her rings, melted into the bones of her hand, and a look on what remained of her face that no one could name, because the best words for it had died with the September. After, the city tried to remember how to be a city. Water wagons ground grooves into the avenues. Men and women carried the living out of the shadow of the walls. Someone found flour where someone else had hidden it. Jon walked in the ashes and the streets and listened to the lists. He listened to Tyrion and to Varys and to Grey Worm and to none of them because the talk inside him was louder than any of theirs. Daenerys stood on the steps of the Red Keep that still stood and spoke to the men who had followed her and to those who had bent the knee because the knee is a hinge and hinges tend to bend where they must. She spoke of breaking wheels and building a world in which none of this would be necessary ever again. Men believed her because belief was a habit and because the air was hot and because they needed a thing to look at that was not their own hands. Gendry went back to Storm's End before the talk grew teeth. He went by the Rose Road because he had never had reason to walk it, and he thought a lord should at least know what was between his seat and his neighbors. He took with him wagons of grain that had been stolen from the Riverlands in the Lannister years and misplaced in the accounts of a man Tyrion knew. He took with him 20 children whose parents had no names for the papers and no time for the streets. He took with him the memory of bells. He told Davos, who rode at his right, "If I live long enough, I'll forget the sound." "If you live right," Davos said. "You won't." They were a day from the Stormlands when the ravens caught them. One letter was from Sansa, that neat, measured hand. She wrote of councils and the need to send men to represent the Stormlands at a great hearing that would render the question of crowns less bloody. She wrote of food and ships and sums. At the bottom she had pressed a little handful of blue petals, with no explanation. Another letter was from Tyrion. 5 lines that said as much as he ever said in 5 lines. The Queen was not at ease. The realm would not soon be at ease. Those who loved Jon were worried about what love required. Gendry folded the letter and set it under the strap at his forearm as if it were a charm. He did not know whether he was supposed to pray to it or keep it from getting wet. The Great Council called itself great because men needed to call things what they were not sometimes, in order to make them inch toward what they should be. Lords came with their banners and their grudges. The Reach sent men fat with harvest and thin with heartbreak. Dorne sent its careful silence and the silver prince of nothing and everything behind it. The Vale sent men who counted by 3s and 5s and thought to keep their mountains with their sums. The Ironborn sent Yara, who had brought the salt with her and did not spill it in the keep's halls only because she was not wasteful. Gendry stood and spoke when he had to. He spoke as he had in the market, plainly, until he was wrong and then he fixed it. He said the realm was a roof and not a spear. He said the realm was a barrel bound with iron hoops because staves alone would splay and drop their wine. He did not speak like a man who wanted a crown. He spoke like a man who had held a rope and burned his hand and was still willing to hold it again. It mattered. Not enough to change men's natures, but enough to shame their habits. Jon did not want a crown. He wanted what he always had. A wall to lean on that would not give way. A woman he could love without burning anyone. A silence between battles long enough to hear water move in a barrel. He was not going to get any of it. Varys moved whispers like coins from hand to hand until someone's hand grew heavy. Tyrion begged the queen to lean on mercy. Mercy is a thin staff. It breaks when a heavier man uses it. The end came, as ends do, both all at once and not at all expected, and it fell in such a way that men were left arguing whether it had to fall. Daenerys walked barefoot through the throne room because the stones had kept the day's heat, and she felt it through her skin as a reminder that warm things die too. She stood near the throne and looked at it and then past it and spoke of worlds, the next and next. Jon came to her and spoke of one world, this one with its small rooms and its poor children and its men who could only count to 5 and had learned to live past 5 by saying fingers twice. He asked her to choose them. She chose what she had always chosen, the idea and the burning. He did what he had learned to do when a person he loved became a knife pointed the wrong way. The queen died leaning into his hands. The dragon mourned in a voice that could have knocked walls down, and then it picked up the seat that had made more trouble than it ever solved and melted it like a candle a child had held too close to a hearth. It carried her and did not look back. Men were left with something like night. In the clean light after, when the dust had made its home and Tyrion had slept 1 hour in 3 days and woken older, the Lord spoke in earnest voices and haggled over futures. Bran, who had come south as if he were a tide, sat in a chair and watched them the way the trees had watched the first men cut them with stone. It was an old man from the Reach who said it first, in the tone of a man who proposes a practical sin. Let the boy be king, the one who does not want, the one who sees the whole. Sansa stood and accepted that the North was not in this choice at all. She declared it a country with its own weather and its own songs, and the rest of them, too tired to fight over one piece of cloth when there were a dozen to stitch, let her. Gendry felt a strange mixture in his chest, a heat and a small cool. He could have wanted this to end a different way. He had made vows to a man who had killed a woman he loved to save every other woman and had thus earned the hatred of those who liked their some simpler. He had bent the knee to a boy whose eyes did not always seem to be looking at the thing he had said they were looking at. It was not neat. It was a smith's job to accept the world as a piece of iron that would not take the shape you asked of it from the first heat. When it was done, and the ships had begun to sail and the carpenters had begun to teach the masons how to build houses that leaned properly into themselves, Gendry returned to Storm's End with a parchment bearing Bran's spidery seal, naming him Lord of Storm's End by the new order as well as by the old vow. This time the castellan opened the gate without speaking. This time the men swore without waiting to sense the wind. This time the market set its prices knowing what bread would cost in a month. And the steward drew lines beneath the sums and said, as if surprised, "We will manage." He set to managing. He set the smithies to making plowshares as well as horseshoes. He set the masons to mending the inner curtain, starting with the place where old storms had eaten at the lime. He wrote to Evenfall and told them to send girls and boys with bright hands, that he would pay them in bread and in something better than bread, names recorded and oaths taken. He wrote to the blacksmiths of King's Landing and told them to send apprentices who wanted to be masters and masters who wanted to teach. He wrote to the Riverlands, to a sept where he had once slept on a bench and eaten wheat too pale to be good, and told them to send him any boy who could count and any girl who could make marks straight and true. He told them to send their small liars too, because liars make better stewards when they've been caught once. He forged sometimes, not because a lord should, but because he was not only a lord. He stood in the heat with the sweat climbing his chest and the soot making a lover of his arms. He made a hammer in the old style because men kept asking him for one, and because it pleased them to see him hold it. He hung it where all could see and used it less because men who need symbols cannot be asked to see the symbol used for common work. He made knives more often, and once he made a set of hinges for a door in a cottage where a woman had lost her husband in the storm and his work made the door hang straight. She cried. He went home and wrote a letter to the steward in King's Landing who had the wrong kind of ledgers, telling him gently how to write them. He did not sign it in a hand that would alarm anyone. He sent it and thought of Arya reading in a corner with a frown. Arya came once in the second summer after the ash. She did not ride to the gate in the manner of a lady or a messenger. She appeared beside the inner well like a fox appearing near a midden. Life making an offer. He felt her before he saw her because the air around him changed. There is a tension that is not fear and not joy but is some third thing that sits in a man's bones like the memory of music. He turned and there she was, boots dusty, hair tied, eyes making their own light. "You look like a lord," she said, not making it a kindness and not making it cruel. "You look like a story mothers tell children so that they'll go to sleep hoping they are better than they are," he said. She laughed. "You have better words than you used to. Sansa lent me some," he said. He gestured. "Come, eat." They ate in the second hall, the one that faced the west, with the narrow windows letting the light in beneath the banners. He told her about harvests and storms. She told him about islands that sat like cats, about a place where there was a tree that looked like a man bending to listen to another man. She did not tell him where. He did not ask. "Do you ever miss it?" she said, and he knew her well enough to know that it could mean a dozen things. The city, the forge, the days when your only duty was to keep your head down and your mouth shut and your breath even, the time before your name decided you. "Every day," he said, "and I wouldn't go back." He looked at his hands. "I keep them dirty and it helps." "You could keep them clean," she said. "I'm not built for it." "I know." She sipped her ale and made a face because the Stormlands made Alesh that took a man by the throat and threw him back in his chair. "Will you marry?" "I will be asked to," he said. "Perhaps I already am." "Will you?" He thought of girls whose hands had been soft as bread dough and of women whose hands had been dried twigs that yet knew exactly how to turn a loaf at the right moment. He thought of lords' daughters with a dozen names and no sure step, and of fisherwomen who knew the color of a storm before it chose its light. "When it will feed the people," he said. "When it will keep the roof on. When it will put a name on a child who needs one." He spread his hands. "I will if I do. I won't if I don't." She nodded as if he had said something sensible. "John is not here," she said. "He writes." "He always did write like a man who was afraid someone would read him," she said softly. "He's gone north." "I know. The watch. There's hardly a watch anymore." "There's always a wall," Gendry said. She looked at him then with sudden fierceness. "Don't become one." He laughed and then stopped when her face did not move. "I'll try," he said. She left as she had come, as if she had always been there and had merely moved to a different corner of the room. He watched her go from the battlements, and the sea threw the low sun back into his eyes so that he had to squint. He lifted a hand and did not wave. He stood until the gulls stopped crying like wives and the water near the shore went the color of pewter. Then he went back to the work. There were famines, small and mean, the kind that tighten belts and sharpen tempers, and he set the granaries to open at weights and measures that did not cheat anyone except the hoarders. There were men who did not like that, and there were men who tried to take what they thought their due, and the courts were hot and useful for a time. There was a year when the storms came early, tearing up the coast like wolves, and he had the roofs that had been thatched twice that summer pulled and done a third time at his own expense, and no one thanked him properly because that is the way of roofs. Their success is silence. There was a day when a boy fell from the rampart and broke his arm in a way that would have killed him in Flea Bottom, and the maester said it and told Gendry he had done well to insist they spend the coin on a fresh supply of needles and on a woman who knew how to boil them to cleanliness. He slept that night as if he had swung a hammer all day. Years thinned. The stag flew from Storm's End and men saluted it because it meant order and sometimes bread. The small folk learned that there was a time each week when they could stand in the second hall and say their piece until someone answered. The knights learned that they were to take off their helms to listen, and that their attention might be the difference between a riot and a drunk man's grudge growing up to be a real fight later. Children learned that the Lord of Storm's End would sometimes sit on the steps and show a boy how to slick a whetstone properly, and that when you did it wrong he would take your hand and turn it without shame and without scorn. He kept the hammer on the wall. He kept his letters in neat bundles tied with twine. He kept a set of travel boots near the door of his chambers in case the sea decided to be difficult in the night and the men at the watchtowers needed a steady look at their lord to keep their steady. Jon's ravens came infrequently and then not at all, and then one came after a long drought and said only that the winter was quiet in a way that made men think they had forced silence upon a wild thing and could now pretend it was tame. Gendry read it twice and then a third time aloud to no one and then put it in the bundle with Arya's one letter and Sansa's many, and Davos's short and full of weather and Tyrion's rare, wry notes about beer that never traveled well. Brienne wrote once with a hand like a careful scrawl carved into stone, telling him she had sworn oaths on oaths, and now there was a boy in the black cells who had laughed at her because he knew he would not make old bones, and this made him freer than any lord at court. Gendry did not know what to write back to that, and so he wrote about hinges. She thanked him. He married. It happened because his steward and his heart came to the same some from different directions one winter. The woman was from Grandview, a Grandison cousin who rode a horse as if it were a table with a stubborn personality, and who had a kindness that worked like sponges, taking in what other people spilled without ruining. She came to the marriage like a carpenter walks into a room, measuring, then smiling, then getting to work. They had a son with dark hair and a daughter with eyes too bright and blue for any polite story. No one needed the story. He did not stop thinking of Arya when the wind was from a certain direction. He did not pretend to himself that thought was anything but what it was. He did not tell his wife. He did not need to. They spoke enough truths to keep from crowding each other out of their own minds. Westeros learned to do without a dragon and learned, slowly, to do without a queen. It learned to have a king who listened and sometimes did nothing because sometimes doing nothing is the right thing. It learned to have a north that did not always answer its summons and yet did not pull the rest of the blanket entirely off the others. The Ironborn learned to steal less from the wrong places. Dorne remembered that it enjoyed the long game more than the quick one. The Reach fell in love 3 times with 3 different ideas of fairness and in the end settled for the one that spared the most bread. Storm's End kept the sea out. That is glory enough for a house. In such glory, Gendry aged the way a man ages when he spends his mornings listening and his afternoons walking and his nights reading by lamplight until the words blur, and he wants a hammer not to strike but to hold. His hair went salt at the temples first, and then, because vanity is a habit that dies hard, he cut it short and pretended he had meant to do that before. His hands never softened. When he held his son's head in his palm, it felt like holding a piece of warm bread dough that might rise into a man if never punched down too often. He taught his daughter the rule about whetstones. She rolled her eyes and did it better than her brother the first time and laughed when he laughed. Jon came once more, years after the council, in a winter that had arrived tardy and found everyone complacent. He came as if he had just walked in from the stable. Snow wet in the hem of his cloak, hair dusted with it, eyes a color that made people think of white roofs at night. He said very little and ate the fish pie as if each bite surprised him by being good. They walked the battlements and listened to the sea pretend to be a story that never ended. "You did well," Jon said. "I broke things and mended them," Gendry said. "That's well," Jon said, and put a hand on the stone as if to be sure it would not go away if he looked away. "I don't know if anyone will ever write any of it down. I don't know if that matters." "It doesn't," Gendry said. "It matters to this wall and to the men who would be wet without it. That's enough." "I thought so," Jon said, and the smile he made was the first easy one Gendry had seen on his face since he had stood in Winterfell and offered a name like a cloak to a boy who was still shivering from the cold of his life. "You didn't need to do it," Gendry said suddenly. "You could have let her do it. It would have suited the stories better. She would have had the Stormlands in her pocket." "I saw a good thing," Jon said. "I wanted it done. I didn't think about pockets." "That's why you don't have one," Gendry said. They stood and did not speak for a long time, the way men do who have spent too much of their lives explaining themselves. When Jon left, he left like weather changing. Gendry watched him go down the steps and across the yard and under the gate and into the road, and he did not call after him. He did not need to. Some names become oaths not by being spoken but by being held. In the years after, when the storms leaned just a little harder than they used to and people forgot a little, as people always do, the story shifted in small ways. Men in the King's Landing forges told their apprentices about the time Lord Gendry and the Onion Knight rang the bells themselves, and the dragon had listened. Boys in Fellwood shouted, "Ours is the fury," and imagined a boy with a hammer bigger than his arm knocking down a wall with one swing. Girls in Evenfall learned to whistle through their fingers and to count to 20 in the Old Tarth way, and they grew up knowing that a woman could be a banner and a sword both, or neither, and still be needed. In the watchtowers along the coast, men put their hands to the stone and said, almost idly, that the wall felt steadier when the Lord had been in the yard that morning, shouting and laughing and asking about their sons. When Gendry died, he did not die grandly. The ground did not shake. The sea did not rear back and make a lane for him to pass. He died after an afternoon of argument about the grain levy and an evening of standing in the forge too long because a boy had made a blade that would not take the edge and Gendry could not leave it as an unkept promise. He went to bed with the ache in his knees men get when they have walked all their lives, and in the morning he did not get up. His wife found him and kissed his forehead and said, as if he were late to a council, "No then." His son stood very straight and then sat down and wept as if someone had knocked the wind out of him. His daughter went to the wall and put her hand on it, and the wall was cool and unfussed. People in the market looked up at the first bell and did not panic. Bells are for many things, and grief is one. The men of the watchtowers stood and took off their helms and did not put them down. John heard about it in a letter that came in the slow season between storms, and a boy stuck in the snow who needed carrying to the next village. He read it once by the fire and once by the door, and then he went outside and stood under a sky that had decided to be great and clear and miserable all at once. He thought of a hall full of smoke and of a boy with a scar on his jaw and of bells. He thought of a hammer hung on a wall by a man who would rather have used it. He closed his eyes and said, as if the words were an order and a prayer both, "He was a good lord." On the day they carved Gendry's name into the stone inside the second hall, facing west, a storm came up out of nowhere, one of those brief tantrums the sea throws to remind men of scale. It pounded the walls as if looking for the old cracks and found fewer than it remembered. It blew out and the light returned, and in that light the letters looked deep. A boy of 12 stood just inside the doorway and leaned his head on the stone as if listening for echoes. When people asked him later what he had heard, he shrugged and said that stone doesn't talk. Then he would smile and add, "Unless you make it." Years later, men would ask when the wheel had been broken and when it had merely been mended, and they would make fine arguments in the King's Peace about the difference. They would write histories with better words than the men who had swung the hammers and held the ropes. They would say the North's departure began one way and the Stormland's return another. They would say the bells spared the city because a dragon chose so, and because men inside chose so, and because men outside chose so, and because fate ran out of teeth. But the people who lived longest and best would remember a winter hall full of smoke and grief, and a king who spoke in a quiet voice, and a boy who knelt and said, "I swear." They would remember the way the sound in the hall changed when the word Lord was said out loud and turned from an idea into a job. They would remember that the storms came and the walls held, and that inside those walls bread rose, and children learned to run with messages and later learned to read them, and that sometimes the Lord of Storm's End took a hammer down from a wall and showed a boy how to hold it so that he did not break his own wrist. And they would say, when they had drunk enough to be honest, that it had mattered who had spoken first and with what kind of heart, in the smoke of Winterfell, when the realm was still choosing the shape of itself from the coals.